It began in the spring of 2022, inside a windowless room deep beneath the Musée de l'Homme in Paris. The air was still, touched by the faint smell of old paper and disinfectant, a mixture that clung to metal drawers and archival gloves. Down here, light was not sunlight but the sterile breath of fluorescent tubes, humming above rows of cabinets that held what remained of other lives. For decades, these drawers had been sealed, labeled with fading ink that no longer obeyed the alphabet of the living. And then, one morning, as part of a long-delayed initiative to catalog what the museum no longer wished to display, a small team of archivists began their quiet excavation of the forgotten. It was a procedure more than a revelation. They moved slowly, methodically, opening one drawer after another, cross-checking tags against a digital register that often returned nothing at all. It was here, among bones categorized by century, that a tray was found whose label had nearly peeled away. The handwriting was erratic, the letters uneven, written perhaps by someone who did not expect the world to read them again. The archivist steadied the tag under the light and spoke the words aloud, as if naming could reverse time. Venus Hottentot. The sound of it lingered in the sterile air, its echo absorbed by the concrete walls. The others looked up. The name was familiar, though uncertain something once mentioned in textbooks, a footnote in the history of anthropology, a case long considered too shameful to recount. The tray held not an artifact but remains, bones arranged by function, not by memory. The archivist who lifted the tag did not know that in doing so she was reopening one of the oldest wounds of colonial exhibition. The moment passed without ceremony, without music or discovery's thrill. It was, as all rediscoveries are, quiet and ordinary day folding into the weight of centuries. Outside, the city moved on. Cars pressed through the morning rain, tourists gathered along the Seine, unaware that beneath their feet, history was shifting in its sleep. The narrator's voice steady, forensic guides the listener through this first image. The world above continues in motion, while the world below exhales the dust of memory. For in this sealed room, the boundary between science and sorrow had always been thin. For generations, the body of one woman had lain beneath labels and institutional silence, known not by her own name but by a name the world had given her. Sara Baartman, born on the southern edge of Africa at the end of the 18th century, taken from her home, exhibited before crowds across Europe, and dissected in the name of knowledge. Her story had been told and retold until it turned to myth, and then mercifully, perhaps forgotten. But history has a habit of returning when least expected, and in 2022, it did so not with fanfare, but with the simple act of inventory. The discovery was not of something new, but of something the world had long known and chosen not to see. The archivists continued their work, photographing, labeling, recording. They followed procedure, unaware that they were touching the remains of a woman whose body had once drawn thousands of eyes. The documentation sheet filled with neat handwriting, female specimen, Khoikhoi origin, 19th century. The precision of the line carried no sense of the life behind it. In the clinical language of museums, humanity is always reduced to description. Yet even in such detachment, there is a quiet tremor, a recognition that beneath the categories lies something unresolved. When the news reached the upper offices, the reaction was cautious. A committee was formed, discussions reopened, memos drafted. The museum had, after all, already faced the question years before how to reconcile with a past that measured and displayed human beings as curiosities, but the discovery reignited a dormant responsibility. Reports circulated between Paris and Cape Town, between historians and governments. What had once been sealed was now subject to light, and light, once allowed in, is difficult to contain. The narrator lingers on this image, the archivist standing still before the open drawer, a faint hum filling the silence, the sound of metal against metal as the tray slides forward, a slow breath, the delicate movement of gloved hands, adjusting bone fragments that no longer belong to any living story. Outside the frame there is no music, no declaration of discovery, only the sound of breath, the turning of paper, the realization that what has been unearthed is not a relic, but a life taken apart. In the days that followed, the name Sara Baartman reappeared in academic discussions and newspaper archives. For many, she was a historical figure whose tragedy had been resolved when her remains were repatriated to South Africa decades earlier. Yet this new discovery suggested that fragments had remained behind, mislabeled, displaced within the labyrinth of collection rooms. The question arose quietly: how much of her had truly returned home? The answer, at least for now, was uncertain. The narrator's voice lowers. There is no accusation, only the slow unveiling of fact. The museum's records from the 19th century were incomplete, the transfer documents inconsistent. Some items listed under her name had never left France. Others had been lost in the bureaucratic shuffle between institutions. It is here, in this uncertain gap between restitution and residue, that the story begins, not as a retelling, but as a reawakening of something unfinished. As the archivist closes the drawer, the sound echoes softly through the corridor. It is not the sound of finality, but of continuation. For history, once disturbed, does not return to rest easily. The frame lingers on the dim light reflecting on glass, on the shadows of labels curling at their edges. A name once spoken as spectacle now hovers in the air again, fragile, waiting to be heard differently. The voice fades with a reflection that every discovery is also an indictment of forgetting. In the silence of that Paris basement, the past had spoken not loudly, not with accusation, but with the faint, steady pulse of a truth refusing to disappear. The sound of the drawer closing lingers for a moment, metallic and final, before the voice returns, almost as if it had been waiting in the silence. The same light hum of the basement remains, the faint vibration of the fluorescent tubes casting an even, colorless glow. It is now the following week. The room has changed, only slightly more documents stacked along the edge of a metal table, more white gloves discarded in small heaps beside specimen bags. The archivists move through the sequence of cataloging with the precision of routine, but beneath that routine something has begun to move, quietly, like water behind glass. The report has been filed, and the museum's internal committee has taken notice. The remains have been confirmed as belonging to a 19th-century Khoikhoi woman, and the label Venus Hottentot has linked back to an entry in an older catalog, written in an archivist's hand that no one now recognizes. The past, once cataloged, has begun to uncatalog itself. The scene widens. Paris, late afternoon. The sound of rain on the museum's steps. The streets are wet, the air heavy with that dull gray light that seems to flatten the world before evening. Somewhere in a cafe nearby, a journalist scrolls through an online archive, piecing together the fragments of a story that feels both familiar and unresolved. There it is again, Sara Baartman, her name appearing in a headline from decades ago when her remains were first returned to South Africa. For most, that moment was closure, a symbolic reconciliation between the living and the dead. Yet the headline was now reborn, not as closure but as question. The journalist leans closer, reading, "Fragments possibly still held in French collections." The cursor blinks at the end of the sentence like a small pulse of conscience. The discovery spreads with the slow rhythm of institutional news emails passed from one department to another, curators consulting old ledgers, phone calls between ministries. Each conversation begins with hesitation. The words are careful, measured, as if speaking too directly might awaken something better left untouched. Yet the fact remains. Among the hundreds of human remains once kept for study, one name carries a weight that none of the others do. The name of a woman turned into a symbol, an argument, a myth, and now, once again, a responsibility. The narrator's voice, low and unhurried, observes how history re-enters the present not through drama, but through administration, through the simple act of record-keeping. The rediscovery of Sara Baartman's presence is not cinematic. It unfolds like a document being slowly unsealed. In the museum's conservation room, the archivists begin to re-examine each tray, checking serial numbers and comparing entries against digital files. One of them pauses before the tray marked with her name, adjusting the tag slightly, ensuring the handwriting is visible in the new photograph. The camera shutter clicks softly, a sound of record, of proof. The air feels dense with time, as if the room has folded the centuries between the woman's death and this moment into a single breath. The narrator describes the stillness, the sense that something once dehumanized is now being looked at differently, not as specimen, but as evidence of what was done in the name of knowledge. Outside, a quiet debate begins to form in editorial offices, in university corridors, in late-night talk shows that still believe history belongs to the past. How much of the past can truly be buried? How much can be returned? The words repatriation, remains, and restitution begin to circulate again, stripped of emotion, heavy with bureaucracy. Yet beneath those words, there is the tremor of recognition that what has been found is not just a body, but a mirror held up to the moral architecture of an era. The voice explains this without sentiment, tracing how curiosity once wore the mask of science, how observation became exploitation, and how a society's fascination with difference disguised its own need for superiority. The narrative moves between the museum basement and the public world above, where headlines flicker briefly across screens before disappearing into the next day's noise. For most, it is a curiosity, another rediscovered relic of colonial history. But for those who understand, it is something deeper, a signal that the past is not linear, that it returns in fragments, insisting on recognition. The voice continues, steady and restrained, recounting the sequence of events that follow. The museum convenes a review board, an anthropologist is called from Marseille, and a South African cultural representative is informed. Meetings are scheduled, press statements drafted. The machinery of restitution stirs again, as it did once before. But this time, the tone is quieter, more uncertain, as though everyone involved senses that there may never be true closure, only the repetition of acknowledgement. The camera of the imagination narrows again, returning to the basement. The archivist now works alone, her gloves dusted with powder, her breath faintly visible in the cold air. She stops for a moment and looks at the name once more. Venus Hottentot. The letters seem to resist being read. They belong to another world, a world that believed in exhibitions, measurements, public dissections. The archivist wonders, perhaps silently, whether saying the name is itself a form of repetition, a reawakening of a language that once reduced a woman to a spectacle. The thought passes quickly. She notes the catalog number, closes the file, and turns off the light. But the question remains, suspended in the air, unspoken. Night settles over Paris. The museum's facade glows faintly under the streetlights, its columns reflecting the rain. A janitor walks through the entrance hall, the sound of the mop echoing softly across the marble floor. The narrator lingers on this sound, describing how every institution, no matter how silent, carries its ghosts. Behind the locked doors, behind the glass cases that hold the relics of humanity's curiosity, there are stories that cannot be fully contained. The remains of Sara Baartman have once again been found, and though her body has been broken down into labeled parts, the act of rediscovery has given her something that science once denied her: a name spoken with awareness, a life acknowledged without spectacle. And yet, even as her story resurfaces, the question begins to take shape not in words, but in the collective breath of those who now know. Who was she before this? What existed before the glass jars and the catalog numbers, before the name that was not hers became the one history remembered? The narrator does not answer. Instead, the voice fades into a low hum, the sound of air through a vent, a pause that feels like hesitation. It is in this pause that the first real silence of the narrative settles, a silence not of absence, but of invitation. The discovery has been made, but understanding remains distant. The archivist's light fades, leaving the drawer closed once more, the name resting in the dark where it has waited for centuries. Above, the city continues, its traffic and voices indifferent to the small, persistent truth awakening below. The story, now fully unearthed from its resting place, waits for the next question. the one that will not ask what was found, but why it was forgotten. The night holds its breath, and somewhere in the echo of the museum's corridors, a name repeats itself softly, as though testing its own meaning for the first time in 200 years. The echo of her name lingers like a vibration that refuses to fade, carried through time, through silence, through the sterile air of history's chambers. It becomes the point of convergence where discovery transforms into inquiry, and inquiry becomes an act of remembrance. The story shifts now into its deeper current, moving backward through the layers of years to the question that no document, no archive, no forensic report has ever answered. Who was Sara Baartman, not as specimen, not as symbol, but as a living woman who once breathed, hoped, feared, and believed in the promise of her own life? The narrator's voice softens, not with sentiment but with the gravity of reconstruction, like a historian brushing soil away from a bone that still holds warmth. The investigation begins with fragments records written by men who never spoke her language, portraits drawn not to honor but to categorize, testimonies shaped by the biases of a century that believed its curiosity to be virtue. To trace her is to move through distortion, through layers of gaze that turned a person into an argument about race, gender, and the anatomy of difference. The scene returns to the early 19th century. The year is 1810. In the Cape Colony, a landscape of vast plains and distant mountains, where the wind carries the scent of salt and dust. In this place, Sara Baartman lives as part of the Khoi community, whose people have endured generations of displacement under Dutch and British rule. The narrator describes her world not as an idealized past, but as one already fractured by colonial intrusion, farmers and soldiers taking land, traders moving between the coast and the interior, lives rearranged by contracts and debt. Sara is young, perhaps in her 20s, perhaps younger. Her exact age will never be known. She works in Cape Town, in service to a Dutch settler named Hendrik Caesars, tending to domestic tasks, washing clothes, cooking, existing in that quiet space of invisibility where most of her life was spent before the world learned to look at her. It is here that her story intersects with those who would carry her away. The first records of her departure appear in shipping logs and court testimonies cold, factual entries that name her not as Sara but as Sarji, a diminutive form used by those who claimed ownership. In these records, she is brought to London under contract, a phrase that conceals more than it reveals. The man responsible, an English ship's doctor named Alexander Dunlop, presents the arrangement as opportunity, a chance for exhibition and profit. The narrator's voice remains still, factual, letting the listener feel the tension between the words contract and consent. There are witnesses who claim she agreed to go, others who insist she was deceived, but time has made the truth unknowable. What is certain is that in the winter of 1810, a ship leaves Table Bay for England, carrying among its passengers a woman who has been promised a future she will never receive. The sound of the ship's timbers creaking merges with the faint wind on the sea, the rhythm of waves becoming the pulse of the narrative. The voyage lasts weeks, the cold growing sharper as they move north, the air changing from salt to smoke. When the ship docks at Portsmouth, the sky is gray, the streets crowded, the smell of coal thick and foreign. From here, Sara is taken to London, a city at the height of its industrial arrogance, a place that feeds on novelty, on the spectacle of otherness. Posters begin to appear, the Hottentot Venus, a wonder of nature. The name transforms her into fiction before she even steps onto the stage. The narrator describes the moment with restraint, the way a forensic photographer might describe evidence without embellishment. She stands behind a curtain, waiting. The crowd murmurs, coins clink, curiosity swells. Then the curtain parts, and the transformation is complete. For the next years, she will be both seen and unseen, her body translated into object, her identity erased beneath the fascination of an empire convinced of its own civility. She is displayed in small theaters and private gatherings, studied by anatomists, debated by men who write treatises about the supposed hierarchy of races. The narrator does not speak in outrage but in observation, tracing how this fascination becomes justification, how a human being becomes proof of theory. In one report, a scientist writes of her proportions, her measurements, her exotic physiology, his words precise and clinical, his gaze absolute. The voice pauses briefly, allowing the weight of the silence to settle before continuing, because the details are almost unbearable in their indifference. At the edge of this analysis, a quieter question begins to emerge, the question that has followed every rediscovery of her story. Was there a moment when she understood what had been taken from her? Did she know, as she stood before those crowds, that she had become a mirror for the empire's imagination? No record answers this. No letter survives, no diary, no voice of her own. History has left only the voices of others, each speaking over her. The narrator reflects on this absence, the way it creates both distance and longing. To tell her story is to acknowledge that it cannot be fully told. Every fact is an approximation, every interpretation an intrusion, yet to remain silent would be another erasure. The investigation gathers its fragments, a legal document from 1810, when abolitionists in London attempted to challenge her exhibition as a form of enslavement, a court transcript where she is brought forward to testify, her words translated by interpreters who may have softened or reshaped them. She insists she is not forced, that she performs of her own will, that she hopes to earn her freedom and return home. Whether she spoke these words or they were spoken for her, no one can say. The court allows the exhibitions to continue, declaring that she is not enslaved but under contract. The law, as always, finds comfort in its own definitions. The narrator's tone remains calm, but the weight of the story grows heavier. The scene shifts between the courtroom and the stage, between the public fascination and the private fatigue that must have shadowed her nights. London is not kind to the foreign or the poor. Its streets are cold, its rooms damp, its crowds relentless. Sara's name becomes a commodity whispered in taverns, written in journals, repeated in caricatures. To the world around her, she is both myth and object, her humanity flattened beneath the weight of fascination. And yet, in the smallest details, traces of the real woman survive. A witness once described her smile, soft and hesitant, as she waited backstage. Another remembered her laughter when she spoke in her own language with a friend from the Cape. These glimpses, scattered like dust in the archives, offer the faintest resistance to erasure. The narrator holds them gently, as though afraid they might dissolve under too much light. The part closes not with conclusion but with a sound, the faint rhythm of the ship's lantern swinging in the dark, its flame catching the wind as if remembering the voyage that began it all. The narrator speaks the final words almost as a whisper, reflecting that every story of discovery must return to its question, and that every question begins with a name. The name that has outlived every exhibition, every theory, every attempt to possess it. The name that once was hers alone. The sound of that lantern continues to sway, its faint motion dissolving into the image of dawn, spreading across the southern tip of Africa, decades before the sea carried her away. The light falls softly over the plains of the eastern Cape, where the air is dry and filled with the low hum of insects awakening with the sun. It is here, long before the name Venus was forced upon her, that Sara Baartman lived as a young woman among her kin, her laughter mingling with the rhythm of daily life, fetching water from the river, grinding grain, caring for the children of her people. The narrator's voice moves through this place not as myth but as quiet reconstruction, describing how a life once ordinary has been reduced by time into a series of museum labels and anthropological footnotes. Yet even within those sterile traces, there is a faint pulse of humanity, something that resists the clean erasure of fact. The world of Sara's youth was already in the shadow of colonial rearrangement. The Dutch and later the British had carved the land into zones of labor and control, forcing entire communities from their grazing grounds. Her people, the Khoikhoi, were known to the colonists by a name not their own, a word derived from mockery and misunderstanding. The narrator describes this history with precision, tracing how language itself became a tool of conquest, how even the way her people were named in European records carried the tone of dismissal. It was through this distortion that Sara's life unfolded, caught between survival and the slow machinery of a world expanding through power and possession. By the time she reached Cape Town, she was already part of an economy that treated human labor as a negotiable asset. She worked as a domestic servant in the household of Hendrik Cesars, a freedman who had himself navigated the fragile boundaries between freedom and dependency. It was through him that she encountered the Englishman Alexander Dunlop, whose interest in her would alter the course of her life. He was a ship's doctor, observant, calculating, always watching for what might be turned into curiosity or profit. To Dunlop and Cesars, the young woman's presence was both opportunity and commodity. They saw in her not only the possibility of spectacle, but the reflection of an empire's hunger for difference. The narrator speaks without anger, only with the measured cadence of record. Dunlop proposed that she travel to England, where she would be exhibited as a living wonder, a woman from the farthest reaches of the world, whose body, they said, defied European comprehension. She would earn wages, he told her, and perhaps return home wealthy, perhaps even free. The words were seductive, the promise vague, the power entirely theirs. There are accounts suggesting she agreed, others that say she had no choice, but all share the same flaw. None of them were written by her. What remains are signatures and testimonies, traces of decisions made on her behalf. History records her departure, not her consent. When the ship left the harbor, the wind carried with it the scent of the sea mixed with wood smoke from the shore. The narrator's voice lingers on that image, the shoreline receding, the land thinning into the horizon, and with it, the last familiar sound of home. To those watching from the docks, it was only another departure among many. To her, it may have been both escape and exile, though no one can say which she believed it to be. The journey to England was long, the ocean restless. Below deck, the air was thick with salt and damp wood, the nights unending. The narrator describes how the world she entered upon arrival was colder, not only in weather but in spirit, a city of factories and narrow streets, where curiosity replaced compassion. London in 1810 was a city enthralled by the spectacle of empire. There were exhibitions of animals, artifacts, and people, each displayed as evidence of discovery. In this climate, Sara Baartman became the latest fascination, a living exhibit for the price of a ticket. Posters called her the Hottentot Venus, the exotic creature from the Cape of Good Hope, the marvel of natural proportion. The words were not hers, and yet they became her identity. Each night she was presented before an audience. A curtain would rise, the murmuring would subside, and the watchers would lean forward. The narrator's tone remains even, describing how the crowd's fascination was dressed in civility, how men in waistcoats and women in silk whispered judgments disguised as observation. Her body was dissected by their eyes, her silence mistaken for consent, her existence translated into entertainment. Behind her, the men who managed her counted their coins and praised the refinement of science that allowed them to transform a person into a case study. The voice slows, letting the weight of this history settle like dust. It was not only the stage that consumed her. Scientists began to visit her privately, to examine and measure, to define her within the growing obsession of the age, the classification of the human. Among them was the French anatomist Georges Cuvier, whose notebooks would later reduce her to a set of measurements and comparisons, each one stripping away the last remnant of identity. The narrator describes this with the precision of a coroner, listing the cold vocabulary of observation: skull, pelvis, curvature, specimen. The language of science has always been the language of distance. Through these long years, fragments of her humanity persisted. Some accounts mention her speaking Afrikaans softly when alone. Others recall that she sang, her voice carrying through the narrow rooms between performances. She had friends among the servants, brief moments of laughter, small acts of defiance that history did not think to record in detail. The narrator holds on to these glimpses as though they are the only true evidence of her existence, the fleeting intervals when she was neither Venus nor exhibit, but a woman remembering herself. But time, in that foreign city, began to turn against her. Illness shadowed her. Poverty followed. When the exhibitions waned and the curiosity of the public moved elsewhere, she found herself abandoned by those who had profited from her. Her health failed, her visibility diminished, and by the winter of 1815, she was alone in Paris, sold from one handler to another, her body still a curiosity even in decline. The narrator speaks of this with the restraint of a witness too late to intervene. There are no clear records of her final days, only reports that she died in December, in a small room near the Rue Saint-André des Arts. The cold that night was severe. Death did not bring her peace. Her body was claimed by science, dissected by Cuvier, her remains preserved and displayed in the Musée de l'Homme for more than a century. The narrator allows the silence to grow here, as if to acknowledge the unspeakable, the transformation from spectacle in life to specimen in death. The body that had been looked upon too much would never again be unseen. The light of dawn fades as the voice continues, now lower, quieter, carrying the slow rhythm of realization. This is the turning point, the moment when a life, stripped of its meaning, becomes an artifact. It is also the moment that history begins to divide her into two beings, the woman who lived and the image the world refused to release. The narrator concludes with the image of a crowd dissolving into mist, the stage empty, the curtain unmoving. Somewhere beyond the silence, a single name remains, trembling at the edge of memory. The stage remains empty, the curtains heavy with the residue of breath and dust, the smell of candle wax still faint in the air. The sound of footsteps fades down a narrow corridor, leaving only the echo of a life that has already begun to blur into story. In this darkness, the narrative shifts into its point of rupture, the moment when the living body, the breathing woman who once stood before the crowd, becomes the stillness upon which history builds its idea of truth. The voice of the narrator steadies, measured as though reconstructing a crime scene long after the evidence has decayed. It is no longer the noise of the crowd that matters, but the silence that follows, the deep, immovable quiet that seeps into the years after her death and refuses to lift. It is December 1815. Paris is recovering from the wreckage of war and revolution. The empire has fallen and risen again, the city's boulevards crowded with soldiers and merchants, its salons filled with arguments about progress and empire. Somewhere in the labyrinth of its narrow streets, Sara Baartman dies, her life ending in obscurity after years of public exhibition. The cause is uncertain. Some say illness, some say drink, others say despair. But these are all forms of conjecture disguised as fact. What remains beyond doubt is that she died alone, in a place that had never been her home. The narrator describes this without sentiment, allowing the listener to feel the emptiness that follows a life reduced to fascination. Within days, her body is claimed by the Muséum National d'Histoire Naturelle. The transfer is recorded in the neat handwriting of a bureaucrat, as though the act of possession could erase its brutality. The name in the ledger reads Femme Hottentot, her humanity dissolved into category. Georges Cuvier, the eminent anatomist of his age, takes interest in her remains. His purpose, he claims, is scientific inquiry, an effort to understand the varieties of mankind. In this reasoning, there is no malice, only certainty, the quiet arrogance of a world that believes its curiosity is benevolence. The narrator lingers on this contradiction, explaining how the century that celebrated reason also perfected the art of dehumanization through measurement and display. The dissection is carried out in the cold light of a laboratory, the air sharp with the smell of preservative and alcohol. Cuvier's notes are meticulous. He writes of muscle structure, cranial shape, proportion. He compares her to animals, not metaphorically but anatomically, each comparison serving as proof of a hierarchy he already believes to be true. His tone in the journals is clinical, devoid of cruelty, which somehow makes it crueler still. The narrator's voice slows here, the words spaced carefully, the rhythm almost reverent not toward Cuvier, but toward the enormity of what he failed to see. He believed he was observing difference. In truth, he was recording the extent of his own blindness. When the examination is complete, her skeleton, brain, and genitals are preserved and exhibited. A plaster cast of her body is made and displayed to the public. For generations, this cast will stand in glass cases, moved from one gallery to another, seen by scholars, tourists, children. To each, it becomes a lesson in anatomy, an object of curiosity, an example of what the 19th century believed it had the right to define. The narrator does not dramatize this. Instead, the description flows with the quiet inevitability of time itself, like dust settling on glass. Her life is over, but her display continues, the performance now eternal. Years pass, the world changes, empires collapse and rebuild, new sciences emerge, old ones decay. The plaster figure remains, still upright, still labeled Venus Hottentot. Visitors pass by, their reflections faintly visible on the glass. Most do not stop for long. She becomes part of the background, a relic of another era, an exhibit so familiar that it no longer provokes discomfort. The narrator observes this with a tone almost mournful in its restraint, the way history transforms atrocity into routine, until the memory of cruelty is replaced by the comfort of ignorance. The century turns. The language of anthropology softens. The rhetoric of superiority gives way to the language of curiosity and preservation. Yet even as theories change, the object remains. Through the wars of the 20th century, through occupation and liberation, she stands unmoving, her image gathering dust but never disappearing. When the museum is bombed, the exhibits are evacuated to storage, and for a time, her display is hidden from view. But once the danger passes, she returns to her case, her label freshly printed, her presence quietly endured by those who prefer not to ask why she remains there. The narrator's voice begins to shift from description to reflection. This is the point at which history turns not on action but on silence, the silence of institutions that preserve without apology, the silence of generations who walked past the glass and said nothing, the silence of nations that built their pride upon the bodies of the colonized, embalmed in the name of knowledge. It is not an angry silence, but a heavy one, dense and enduring, the kind that fills the corners of archives and seeps into the fabric of civilization. It is this silence that becomes the subject now, not the spectacle, not the dissection, but the void that follows both. The narrator describes the museum's corridors during those years, the polished floors, the smell of dust and formaldehyde, the long rows of cabinets containing the evidence of empire. Students walk through them, their footsteps echoing softly. Some pause to look, others hurry past. The faces behind the glass do not change. Generations of the living pass before the unchanging gaze of the dead. Time becomes circular. The woman who once lived, who once breathed the air of the Cape and the smoke of London, remains suspended in a permanence she never chose. Decades later, as the world begins to reckon with the remnants of colonialism, the questions return. They are quiet at first: letters from scholars, requests from governments, whispers from journalists. Then they grow louder. Why is she still here? Why has she not been returned to the soil from which she was taken? The museum responds with hesitation, the weight of tradition pressed against the moral pressure of the present. The narrator does not accuse. Instead, the voice observes how institutions move slowly, like tectonic plates, centuries of justification needing decades to shift even an inch. The part draws to its close with the image of that museum in stillness once more, the air cool and undisturbed. Outside, the seasons change, revolutions come and go, and yet behind the glass, her form remains unaltered. It is not until the late 20th century that the first serious call for her return will be heard, a call born not from outrage but from recognition. But for now, in the lingering shadow of the 19th century, the silence persists. It stretches across the decades like a sheet of glass, transparent, solid, unbroken. The final image is that of the plaster figure in the dark, illuminated by a single bulb hanging from the ceiling. The light flickers once, then steadies. In the reflection of the glass, the viewer can see themselves, faintly, standing in the same space as the ghost of what their world once called science. The narrator's voice, barely above a whisper, closes the scene. In every museum lies a quiet contract between the living and the dead, and in the silence between them, the weight of what cannot be undone. The light above her case flickers and steadies again, the hum of electricity faint but persistent, the sound of a place that has forgotten what silence means. It is here, among corridors of stone and glass, that the years begin to stretch into decades of absence. Time passes differently in a museum. Dust settles slowly, and yet every second carries the weight of what has been withheld. Sara Baartman remains on display, her plaster image unchanging while the city outside rearranges itself through war, occupation, liberation, and the quiet rhythm of ordinary life. The people who pass by her case no longer look with fascination, but with a kind of dulled endurance. Children on school trips follow their guides, notebooks in hand, eyes glancing briefly before moving on to the next exhibit. Lovers wander through on rainy afternoons. Scientists in white coats adjust labels and clean the glass. Each act of maintenance, each indifferent gesture, becomes part of the ritual of forgetting. The narrator's voice follows this motionless passage of time with a tone both clinical and elegiac, describing how a life once lived has been distilled into form and function, her memory stored among thousands of others in the catalogue of empire. It is the early 20th century now, and anthropology has become both discipline and defense. The study of the human is used to justify borders, hierarchies, identities. Her image, once a spectacle for crowds, is now cited in journals and academic lectures. The language changes, but the gaze does not. The plaster figure is transported from one building to another, each new curator inheriting the same responsibility, to preserve what the last generation considered valuable. The narrator explains that preservation, when detached from conscience, becomes another form of erasure. It keeps the body intact while ensuring the story remains incomplete. In 1940, as Europe fractures again into war, the museum closes its doors. The exhibits are wrapped in cloth, packed in crates, and moved to basements for safekeeping. Sara's case is dismantled, her form wrapped in layers of paper and linen, her glass shattered and replaced with wood. The narrator describes this process as both burial and reprieve, the moment when the light finally leaves her for the first time in over a century. The crates are stored in tunnels beneath the city, where they remain untouched for years. The sound of footsteps fades above them, replaced by the drone of air raid sirens and the dull rumble of artillery. Down here, among the bones of empires, history holds its breath. When the war ends, the crates are reopened, the exhibits return to their rightful places, the illusion of continuity restored. But something has shifted. The museum's new generation of curators inherits not pride, but unease. The narrator describes the subtle tension of those years, the slow, quiet recognition that the collections contain more than scientific data, that they carry the remnants of violence too refined to name aloud. Still, nothing changes. The doors reopen, the visitors return, and the plaster Venus resumes her place in the dim light of the Anthropology wing. The years between 1950 and 1970 are years of forgetting. The French colonies fall one by one, independence spreads across Africa, and yet here, within this building by the Seine, the old world persists, untouched by the revolutions outside its walls. The narrator's tone remains steady, the voice neither condemning nor forgiving, but tracing the stillness with forensic care. Each decade adds a new layer of dust, each visitor a new reflection in the glass. Her body becomes invisible through familiarity. Even the guides no longer speak her name. She stands among the fossils, the skulls, the preserved hearts and brains objects once alive, now arranged in perfect order. Time inside this place is not linear but recursive, looping back upon itself, repeating the same act of looking and not seeing. And yet somewhere beyond these walls the world begins to remember her. It happens quietly. At first a mention in an academic article, a question raised by a South African scholar about the remains of colonial subjects kept in European museums. Then, gradually, the silence starts to fracture. Letters are written, meetings proposed, voices rise in parliament, in classrooms, in the quiet offices of diplomats who must now decide how to untangle 2 centuries of possession. The narrator's voice sharpens slightly, tracing this slow emergence of moral gravity. It has taken nearly 200 years for the living to hear the echo of a woman whose own voice was never recorded. The museum resists at first. The argument is familiar, that the past cannot be undone, that these collections serve education, that science must not yield to sentiment. Yet beneath these justifications lies an unease that grows harder to disguise. The public is changing. The gaze that once justified display now feels invasive. In the late 1980 seconds, newspapers begin to question the ethics of human remains in national collections. The case of the Hottentot Venus resurfaces. Her name once again passed through the hands of journalists, scholars, and activists. Each retelling brings her closer to being seen again, not as object, but as person. The narrator describes the museum at night during these years, the exhibits lit only by emergency lamps, the silence more complete than usual, as if the walls themselves are listening. In one of the storage rooms, the plaster cast stands against a wall, no longer displayed but not yet returned, the paint on its surface beginning to crack. It is 1994, and the city outside vibrates with celebration. Nelson Mandela has been elected President of South Africa, and his government sends an official request to France for the return of Sara Baartman's remains. The letter is formal, its tone dignified, its language carrying the weight of history long denied. What it asks for is simple restoration of dignity, repatriation of the body to the land of her birth. The correspondence begins, slow and cautious. Cultural ministries debate, curators deliberate, politicians consult advisors. For the first time in nearly 2 centuries, her story is being discussed not in the language of curiosity but of justice. The narrator's voice remains even, describing the bureaucratic exchanges with the rhythm of ritual, each signature, each translation, each polite refusal. Years pass as negotiations falter and resume, documents exchanged and archived. But history, once awakened, does not sleep again. The pressure builds quietly, persistently, until resistance becomes untenable. And so, in the spring of 2002, the museum concedes. The remains of Sara Baartman are officially transferred to South Africa. The plaster cast is removed from the archives and placed in a crate. The lights of the storage room flicker, as if acknowledging the departure. The crate is sealed, marked with her name, not the name given by the world, but the one she carried before history intervened. The narrator describes the moment without triumph, only with the still precision of observation, a gesture 2 centuries late, yet still necessary. As the crate is lifted into the light, the dust drifts upward in a slow spiral, catching the air like ash. The sound of footsteps accompanies it through the corridor, down the stairs, out into the sunlight, where the air is sharp and bright. For the first time since her death, the movement of her body is voluntary, not her own, but guided by intention rather than exploitation. It is a beginning again, a slow exhalation after a silence too long kept. The part closes on the image of the crate resting on the tarmac of an airport, sunlight reflecting off its surface. Around it, workers move carefully, unaware of the history they are carrying. The narrator's voice fades to a near whisper as the cargo door closes and the engines begin to hum. A life once reduced to spectacle now begins its final journey home. The airplane hum becomes the heartbeat of distance, a low, continuous vibration rising from the engines as they turn against the weight of sky. The scene opens in quiet motion, the crate, unremarkable in its appearance, resting in the cargo bay of a long-haul flight. There are no markings of ceremony, no flag, no escort, only a serial number and a declaration of contents. Human remains. The narrator's voice follows the rhythm of the aircraft, slow and unwavering, describing how history now moves not with the grandeur of events, but with the precision of logistics. Outside, the clouds drift below like soft, indistinct continents, and for the first time in nearly 200 years, Sara Baartman is returning home. The arrival takes place on a clear day in Cape Town, the sunlight sharp, the horizon luminous with heat. Workers on the tarmac move without awareness of what they carry. To them, it is only another box among thousands. Yet beyond the fences, the city knows. News cameras wait at the edge of the airstrip, their lenses fixed on the arriving plane, ready to document what will be called a homecoming, though the home itself no longer remembers the woman who once left it. The narrator speaks with care, describing the scene not as celebration but as an act of historical correction, an attempt to reattach meaning to a life that was once taken apart piece by piece. The crate is transferred to a convoy bound for the Eastern Cape. It travels along highways lined with yellow grass and wind-bent fences, through small towns where children pause to watch as it passes, unaware of the name it carries. The road unwinds through the Karoo, vast and empty, where time itself seems to stretch. The narrator lingers on the landscape, its stillness echoing the silence that has followed her for centuries. This journey is both physical and symbolic, a reversal of direction, the movement of the colonized body back through the arteries of empire toward the soil that first gave it form. The scene transitions to the small town of Hankey, her birthplace. It is 2002, nearly 2 centuries since she last breathed this air. The town has prepared a site of burial, the earth turned carefully, a wooden platform erected for the ceremony. Across the hills, crowds begin to gather, elders wrapped in blankets, children holding paper flags, officials in dark suits. The narrator's tone remains neutral, observing rather than participating, describing the mixture of solemnity and spectacle. There are prayers in languages that she may once have known, songs rising from the crowd in slow, mournful rhythm. And yet beneath it all there is a sense of peace, not triumph, not restitution, but the still acknowledgement of something finally set down. Government officials speak of history, of reconciliation, of the long journey from humiliation to dignity. Their words echo through loudspeakers, drifting toward the fields where cattle graze. They speak of national healing, of closing wounds, of returning the past to its rightful place. But the narrator moves through these speeches without commentary, focusing instead on the quieter moments, the woman in the crowd who wipes her eyes, the child who does not understand why everyone is standing still, the old man who hums softly along with a hymn. History, the narrator reminds us, does not end in ceremony, it only shifts its form. When the coffin is lowered, the air changes. A breeze moves across the field, carrying the scent of dry grass and soil. The people fall silent. The narrator's voice grows softer, describing how each handful of earth that falls is both an offering and an apology. The sound of soil striking the coffin is slow, deliberate, rhythmic, the same sound that closed her story once before in Paris, now reversed, now redefined. The crowd begins to disperse, some lingering, some turning away. The sun lowers behind the hills. The field, once filled with voices, becomes still. In the quiet that follows, the story seems to pause again, but the narrator does not stop. Instead, the voice turns inward, reflecting on the strangeness of closure in the context of injustice. Can the return of bones restore the life that was taken? Can the burial of remains erase the memory of display? The answer, of course, is no, but there is another kind of truth in the act, the recognition that remembrance is itself a form of resistance. To name her, to bring her home, to lay her down in the soil that once knew her name, these are the gestures through which the living negotiate with the past. Night falls over the Eastern Cape, the hills darken, the air cools, the The last visitors leave the gravesite, their footsteps fading along the dirt path. Only the sound of crickets remains, the slow, steady rhythm of life continuing. The narrator's voice returns to the same measured tone with which the story began, almost indistinguishable from silence. The act of burial, it says, is not an end but a restoration of balance. The woman who was turned into symbol, who was rendered into glass and plaster, is once again part of the landscape, her body indistinguishable from the dust, her name no longer confined to the vocabulary of empire. Far away, in the archives of Paris, the empty space she once occupied remains. The case is gone, but its outline still lingers faintly on the wall, a rectangle of lighter color where dust did not settle. Curators walk past it without comment. The narrator describes this absence with a quiet precision. The museum, like history, has learned to continue without acknowledging what it has lost. Yet the emptiness speaks, soft and persistent, reminding anyone who listens that every object removed leaves behind a shadow of itself. And so, after 2 centuries of display and silence, her journey ends not with discovery or revelation, but with stillness. The air above her grave is clear, the grass bends in the wind, and for the first time, her story belongs to no one but itself. The narrator lets the final image linger, the mound of earth under the pale light of dawn, the soft hum of insects, the horizon widening beyond the hills. It is neither sorrow nor triumph, it is completion, a return to the quiet order of the world. The earth above her grave settles slowly, the wind passing over it like a whisper that carries no destination. Dawn moves across the landscape in thin bands of light, turning the grass silver for an instant before returning it to its muted green. The world has resumed its rhythm, birds cross the sky, and the town stirs awake. Yet beneath that surface, calm lies the quiet persistence of something unresolved, the awareness that this burial, however dignified, has not silenced the deeper echo of her name. The narrator's voice re-emerges from that silence, lower now, almost contemplative, tracing the path of memory that extends beyond the ceremony. For though Sara Baartman has been returned to the soil, her story remains suspended between fact and reflection, its truth incomplete, its meaning still shifting like sand underfoot. In Paris, the empty glass case stands as both absence and accusation. Its space has been left intentionally vacant, the plaque removed, the dust unpolished. Visitors still pause before it, sensing that something once occupied that air. Some look for the missing label. Some move on quickly, others linger in the vague discomfort of recognition. The narrator speaks of this silence as a form of revelation, that sometimes history's most honest confession is not in what it shows, but in what it can no longer display. The museum has learned the vocabulary of apology words like restitution and reconciliation, but language alone cannot dissolve the residue of centuries. Each object that remains on the shelves, each skull catalogued by number, continues to testify in its own mute way to the arrogance of a world that once believed it could possess another's body as knowledge. Meanwhile, in South Africa, her grave becomes a site of pilgrimage. School children visit on national holidays. Tourists arrive with cameras. Scholars deliver speeches about the symbolism of her return. The land that once erased her now performs remembrance with ceremony and care. Yet the narrator's voice does not romanticize this. It moves slowly through the contradictions, observing how remembrance itself can become another form of display. Statues are raised, documentaries produced, essays written. The woman who was once reduced to anatomy has now become emblem, a vessel for guilt, pride, and moral instruction. And still, her own voice is missing. The narrator describes the paradox with quiet precision, how history, in its attempt to restore, continues to speak for the silenced. Even in reverence, she remains interpreted. The story turns inward again. The narrator reflects on the larger revelation unearthed by her journey, the uncomfortable truth that progress is not linear, that civilization does not evolve uniformly toward justice, but loops through cycles of recognition and forgetting. Each generation rediscovers her name as if for the first time, declares it sacred, and then lets it fade again into abstraction. The same happens with all histories built on suffering. They are remembered not to be understood, but to be endured, to assure the living that they have learned something. Yet the evidence of that learning is fragile. One only has to look at the world, the borders still drawn by difference, the fascination still attached to the exotic, the way the body continues to be politicized to understand that her story is not confined to the past. The narrator imagines for a moment what Sara Baartman might have seen if she could stand now among those who speak her name. Would she recognize herself in the speeches, in the memorials, in the carefully printed textbooks? Or would she remain a stranger to this century as she was to the last? The thought lingers, not as sentiment but as question, a recognition that memory, like justice, is an ongoing negotiation between what we can restore and what we must accept as lost. Her body may rest beneath African soil, but her image continues to live in the minds of those who look, study, and remember. The plaster cast may be gone, but the idea of her has become another kind of permanence. In this light, the narrator returns to the notion of the museum not as building but as metaphor. Every society, it says, builds its own museum, a space in which it preserves both its virtues and its crimes. Some exhibits are proudly displayed, others hidden in basements, awaiting rediscovery by future generations who will call them mistakes. The rediscovery of Sara Baartman is one such cycle. Her name was once whispered with fascination, then buried under shame, then lifted again as symbol. Each time she is found, the world sees not her, but itself, its hunger for meaning, its need to prove that it can feel remorse. The narrator pauses, allowing the silence to deepen. Outside the frame of this reflection, the wind continues to move across the valley. A small white flower grows at the edge of her grave, its petals trembling. The sound of an approaching storm rises faintly in the distance. Time, indifferent and constant, passes over the land. In the quiet between gusts, the listener hears the echo of the question that has followed this story since the beginning. What does it mean to restore dignity to someone whose humanity was once denied by the very act of observation? There is no clear answer, only the understanding that remembrance is never complete, that it exists not in words but in the quiet act of seeing differently. The narrator's voice lowers again, closer now, as if speaking from the threshold between worlds. The rediscovery, it says, is not about returning what was lost, but about recognizing the loss itself as part of our inheritance. Every time her story is told, a small fragment of silence breaks, and through that fracture, something living passes a recognition, faint but real, that the past is not behind us, but within us, layered into the marrow of our understanding. The revelation, then, is not hers, it is ours. She has already crossed the distance. It is the living who remain here, still learning to look at the human face without the shadow of classification. The scene fades as the storm approaches. The grass bends beneath the first drops of rain. The narrator's final words for this part drift with the sound of thunder receding over the hills. That truth, once uncovered, cannot return to darkness. It can only change its shape, and through it, we see the outlines of our own reflection, quiet and unflinching, in the mirror of her long and unfinished return. The rain that begins as a whisper soon becomes steady, a curtain of sound that softens the contours of the landscape and folds the world into a single, muted rhythm. It falls across the field where she lies, washing the soil dark, drawing the scent of earth upward into the air. For a moment there is no history, no record, no difference, only the water connecting sky to ground, the same as it has done for millennia. But even as the rain continues, the narrator's voice returns, slower now, its tone carrying the weight of the unanswered. It begins not with a statement but with a pause, as if reluctant to disturb what the silence has momentarily healed. What remains, it says, after the burial and the return, after the speeches and the ceremonies, after every word of restitution has been spoken? What remains when the story that once defined injustice has been told to exhaustion, and yet the ache beneath it endures? The air over the eastern cape holds no reply. The world, as it always does, resumes its cycles. Grass grows, flowers bloom, insects move through the soil. Life continues, but the questions left behind remain heavier than the earth that covers her. The narrator's tone becomes almost forensic again, tracing the gaps between what is known and what cannot be known. There are no letters, no diaries, no first-hand accounts of her inner life. We cannot know what she dreamed of on the voyage to England, what she felt when the crowd first turned to stare, what she thought as the years grew cold and the rooms darker. Her silence is the most complete form of evidence, an archive of absence that resists interpretation. And yet that very silence has become her voice. Each generation that rediscovers her attempts to fill that void with meaning, constructing versions of her from empathy, from outrage, from curiosity. She has been called victim, survivor, martyr, icon, and all of it is true and false at once. The narrator's words move gently through these contradictions, acknowledging how history's compassion can sometimes resemble possession, how even the attempt to honor can become another act of claiming. The world wanted to own her body. Now it wishes to own her story. Both desires, however distant in intention, are mirrors of each other. In the century that followed her death, there were others like her bodies collected, studied, stored. Some are still waiting to return home, names forgotten or misfiled under the euphemisms of science. The narrator lists them not by name but by place: skulls in boxes in Berlin, skeletons in London, faces cast in plaster in Vienna and Amsterdam, each one a chapter in the same book of human curiosity and denial. Sara Baartman's rediscovery is not an isolated event, but a symptom of a larger remembering, a wave of conscience that rises and falls as the world negotiates what it means to be human. The question, though, remains the same: what do we do with the knowledge that the foundations of our understanding were built upon the unconsented lives of others? The rain thins, leaving behind a stillness more profound than silence. The narrator reflects on the fragility of truth, how it shifts depending on the hands that hold it. For the scientists of her time, truth was measurement. For the historians who followed, truth was correction. For the descendants who now visit her grave, truth has become memory, an act of presence. But perhaps, the voice suggests, truth is none of these things. It is only the act of looking without ownership, of remembering without reconstruction. Perhaps the truest form of restitution is the willingness to leave a life undefined, to allow its mystery to remain intact. The world today continues to speak her name, but mostly as metaphor. Her story appears in classrooms, in art, in whispered apologies that nations make to themselves. It has become a lesson, a warning, a mirror for progress. Yet each repetition distances her further from her own humanity, turning her once again into symbol. The narrator moves through this thought slowly, carefully, like a hand tracing the outline of something fragile in the dark. Symbols are necessary, it says, but they are also dangerous. They allow us to feel that we have understood, when in truth we have only named. The image returns to Paris once more, to the empty case, to the faint reflection of the present upon the glass that once held her likeness. A visitor passes, unaware of the history embedded in that emptiness. Another stops, stares, and reads the small inscription that has replaced the label "Cette vitrine reste vide en mémoire de Sara Baartman." This case remains empty in memory of Sara Baartman. The narrator lingers on that line. It is a gesture both humble and immense, an admission that sometimes the most ethical way to remember is to refuse to display. The void itself becomes testimony, a presence shaped by absence, a reminder that to look is also to be responsible for what one sees. Back in South Africa, the seasons change. Rain gives way to dust, dust to wind, wind to firelight. The field where she rests grows over with wildflowers, whose names have no translation in the language of conquest. The villagers who live nearby tend to the ground, trimming the grass, clearing the path, not from obligation but from quiet recognition. She is no longer spectacle or specimen here. She is part of the land's continuity, an invisible thread woven back into its living fabric. The narrator's tone softens, the cadence approaching something almost tender as it describes this merging. Death, it says, is not always an ending. It can also be a way of returning to scale, to proportion, to the natural measure of existence from which civilization has so often strayed. The part closes as evening falls once more over the valley. The sun sinks behind the ridges, and a faint mist gathers near the river. The wind carries the scent of soil and smoke, the murmuring of insects rising with the dark. The narrator's final words for this section are almost inaudible, dissolving into the sound of the wind, that some answers are not meant to be spoken, only remembered, and that remembrance itself is the closest thing the living will ever have to understanding. Night descends slowly over the valley, and the darkness gathers without resistance, soft and unhurried, as if the earth itself exhales. The horizon folds into shadow until there is nothing left but the whisper of wind through grass and the faint rustle of unseen creatures moving in the fields. The narrator's voice emerges from that darkness, quiet, deliberate, carrying the weight of completion. It does not begin with introduction or explanation. It simply continues, as if the story itself has learned to speak in the same rhythm as the land that now holds her. It has been told many times before her life, her loss, her return, but never does it end. Stories like hers do not conclude. They transform, returning to those who listen, shaping their understanding of what it means to belong, to remember, to see. In this last telling, the voice turns not toward her, but toward us. History, it says, is not a line but a circle, a slow orbit around the same unlearned truths. We keep revisiting them, renaming them, believing each rediscovery is progress, when perhaps it is only a deeper descent into reflection. The case in Paris remains empty, and yet its emptiness continues to speak. The grave in Hanky is full, and yet its fullness continues to echo. Between these two silences, the absence of display and the stillness of burial, there is a space where memory lives, fragile and luminous, like breath on cold glass. The narrator recalls the first moment, the drawer sliding open in that Paris basement, the name written on a tag barely legible. It was a beginning disguised as an end, a small disturbance that reopened the wound of forgetting. And now, here, the story folds back upon itself. The same breath that lifted the dust of archives now stirs the air above her resting place. What began as investigation has become reflection. What began as curiosity has become reverence. The journey has led us through discovery, degradation, silence, restitution, and now into something quieter, an understanding that history's truest form of closure is not resolution, but the acceptance of what cannot be repaired. The voice grows softer, slower, as if each word must be weighed against the quiet that surrounds it. There are things we can measure: the years of her life, the distance between continents, the number of documents that bear her name, but none of these are the sum of her existence. The rest is invisible. The warmth of her voice when she spoke in her mother tongue, the rhythm of her footsteps along the shore, the sound of laughter that no archive can hold. These are the truths that lie beyond recovery, yet they are also the truths that endure. They are what makes her more than a chapter in the history of injustice. They make her human again, if only in imagination. The narrator pauses, as if to listen to the wind itself. The sound is constant, neither mournful nor triumphant, simply alive. It carries no judgment, no agenda. It does not distinguish between those who harmed and those who tried to heal. It moves freely over all things, over the graves and the archives alike, binding them in the same silence. And in that silence, there is peace, not the peace of conclusion, but of continuity, the peace of knowing that memory itself is alive, restless, unwilling to be forgotten again. The story widens once more, shifting beyond Sara Baartman, beyond the museum and the grave, to the greater landscape of remembrance. Everywhere, the world holds its unreturned names, its lost bodies, its unspoken histories. Each carries the same faint rhythm, the same unanswered question: what do we owe the dead, beyond the act of remembering them? The narrator does not answer. It merely allows the question to remain, suspended in the air like mist. Because perhaps the answer is not in words, but in the simple, enduring effort to look back, to keep looking, even when there is nothing left to see. The tone now grows faint, almost like the murmur of a late-night broadcast, a voice speaking softly to those who have not yet fallen asleep. It tells us that to remember is not to relive, nor to repair, but to recognize. Recognition is the act of standing still within the echo of another's life and hearing it as one's own. To recognize Sara Baartman is to acknowledge not only her suffering, but our inheritance of it, the structures built upon it, the gaze that still lingers in modern forms of spectacle. The work of history, the voice says, is not to judge the past, but to understand the present through its shadow. The rain returns faint and rhythmic, as if time itself were drawing the curtain closed. The narrator's words begin to fade into long pauses, the kind that allow the listener's thoughts to wander. It describes one final time, the landscape as seen from above, the curve of the river, the winding road, the faint lights of the town in the distance. Somewhere within that quiet expanse lies her grave, indistinguishable from the land, as it should be. The light from a distant farmhouse flickers once, then goes out. The air holds its breath. And then, in the final moments, the voice lowers to a whisper, almost indistinct. History, it says, does not end, it settles. The past does not disappear, it changes shape, finding its way into the language of the living, into the spaces between what is said and what is felt. The story of Sara Baartman, once buried under centuries of silence, has not been told to end sorrow but to illuminate it, to remind us that remembrance is not an act of pity but of continuity. The night stretches wide, the stars faint above the valley. The last sound is that of wind passing through tall grass, the same sound that once moved through her childhood, the same that will outlast every retelling. And then the voice fades completely, leaving only the steady quiet of the world, unjudging, unending, serene. The quiet remains after the voice fades, suspended like the final vibration of a struck string. It hovers over the land and within the listener, not as absence but as persistence, the sound that memory makes when it no longer needs to be spoken aloud. The story has ended, yet it continues circling through the mind like a shadow that does not leave with light. For in truth, stories such as hers are never confined to the years in which they occurred. They belong to every age that dares to look at itself honestly. The narrator's voice returns once more, faint and steady, to guide the listener gently out of the darkness, not with closure but with understanding. It begins by recalling the first image, that basement in Paris, the drawer sliding open, the soft echo of metal against metal, the name discovered again after centuries of silence. It had been a moment of unintentional revelation, a small act of bureaucracy that reopened a wound too deep for any one nation to claim. From that motion came the long unraveling, the rediscovery, the reckoning, the return. Each part of this journey, the narrator says, was a mirror held up to those who encountered it. The archivists, the journalists, the scholars, the citizens they all faced, in her story, the reflection of their own time's moral blindness. For what was done to her was not the crime of a single century, but the pattern of all human history, the tendency to turn wonder into possession, difference into spectacle, and memory into control. As the story folds into reflection, the voice becomes softer, more interior. It speaks now as if addressing not an audience, but a single listener alone in the quiet of night. The past, it says, is not something that lives behind us. It is sediment, gathering beneath every thought, every word we use to describe the world. To speak of progress is to speak over the murmur of those who never had the chance to define it. To honor the dead is to learn how to hear that murmur without rearranging it into comfort. The lesson of Sara Baartman's life is not in the horror of what was done to her, but in the ordinariness of those who did it, how easily cruelty hides behind curiosity, How swiftly dignity can vanish beneath the illusion of purpose. The scene widens again, moving beyond her grave, beyond the museum, beyond even the continents that once divided her life. The narrator describes the world as it exists now, still circling the same questions under different names. Museums that hold thousands of bones, archives that whisper through drawers never opened, histories still written in the language of power. And yet, amid all this, there is also the slow awakening of conscience, the recognition that knowledge, to be just, must also be tender. There are scientists who now study only to restore, historians who seek the voices left between the lines, artists who turn absence into presence. The world is learning, imperfectly, to look with humility. The voice pauses, the silence filled with the sound of wind over the plains, the same wind that once carried ships toward the Cape, the same that later filled the sails of those who left it behind. In its movement there is no judgment, only endurance. Time continues, but memory alters its shape, it seeps into the soil, into the language of those who speak her name with reverence instead of spectacle. Somewhere, in a classroom far from both Paris and the Karoo, a child will hear of her for the first time, and the story will settle differently. It will not be a tale of tragedy, but of recognition of how the world once forgot, and how forgetting became the deepest wound of all. The narrator speaks again, almost to itself now, a tone of weary clarity in its cadence. Every life, it says, is eventually reduced to evidence bones, names, records, but between those fragments lies the true measure of being, the moments that leave no trace, the warmth of skin in sunlight, the breath between laughter and speech, the private certainty of being alive. These are the things that no empire can own and no museum can display. In remembering Sara Baartman, we are not reclaiming her body but acknowledging the persistence of her humanity in the face of a history determined to deny it. That is the quiet justice her story gives to the world, a reminder that empathy, once awakened, cannot return to ignorance. The night deepens. Stars surface above the valley, countless and indifferent, their light reaching across centuries to the same ground where she rests. The voice continues, slow and deliberate, each word leaving space for the echo to breathe. We, it says, are the custodians of what the past leaves behind. Not the artifacts or the documents, but the awareness, the fragile, flickering understanding that every act of remembrance carries a responsibility. To remember her is not to keep her alive as symbol, but to guard against the forces that once erased her. To look upon her story is to look inward, to ask where within ourselves such erasures still reside. The wind subsides, the air stills, the narrator's final words move like a whisper through the quiet. History does not belong to those who wrote it, but to those who continue to listen. Sara Baartman's story is not a relic of injustice, but a measure of our capacity to confront it. She was taken, displayed, dissected, forgotten, and at last returned, but even now, she remains not as victim, nor as saint, but as mirror. Through her, the world sees itself, unguarded and unadorned, stripped of pretense, left only with the truth of what it chooses to remember. The silence that follows is complete. The field lies under the watch of moonlight, the air cool and clear. The camera of imagination withdraws upward, showing the vastness of the land, the thin line of the river, the invisible resting place that now belongs wholly to the earth. There is no music, only wind and distance, the sound of a story returning to stillness. The last image fades a horizon endless and serene, where the past no longer demands to be seen, only understood.